You stand in the dark. The candle is lit. You don't know what you are doing, but something in you does. You are holding a bundle of old parchment. Your hands are shaking. The words on these pages have the power to dismantle empires. Why? Because they do not ask you to bow to a priest. They do not tell you to beg a distant god for mercy. They tell you that you are already divine. This exact realization struck the heart of Europe in the late 15th century. The texts you are holding are real. They are called the Corpus Hermeticum. For hundreds of years, these 17 Greek treatises were entirely lost to the Western world. They were whispered about as myth. They were buried in the sands of Egypt. They were locked away in Macedonian monasteries. Then, in 1460, a monk named Leonardo da Pistoia rode into Florence carrying a single, weathered manuscript. He handed it to the ruler of the city, Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo was a man who understood power. He was the wealthiest banker in Europe. He was a kingmaker. He was the greatest patron of the Renaissance. Cosimo immediately summoned his chief scholar, Marsilio Ficino. Ficino had dedicated his life to translating the complete works of Plato. It was the most important intellectual project of the era, but Cosimo ordered him to stop. Stop translating Plato. Translate this instead. What was inside these pages that made the most powerful man in Europe halt the translation of Western philosophy's greatest thinker? The Corpus Hermeticum claimed to contain the ancient wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus. This was a legendary figure who combined the knowledge of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. The texts were believed to predate Moses. They were thought to hold the original, uncorrupted theology of humanity, even though a scholar named Isaac Casaubon would later prove in 1614 that the texts were actually written in Hellenistic Egypt around the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The chronological truth did not matter. The philosophical payload had already detonated. The texts were not a collection of spells. They were a manual for human consciousness. The core teaching of the Corpus Hermeticum is a concept called gnosis. Gnosis is a Greek word that means direct, experiential knowledge. It is not faith. It is not blind belief. It is knowing. The Hermetic texts taught that the ultimate reality, the divine mind, or nous, did not create the universe as a separate physical object. Instead, the universe is a thought in the mind of God. Because human beings possess a mind, we share in the exact same substance as the Creator. You are not a fallen creature living in a cursed world. You are a localized fragment of the divine intelligence experiencing itself. This leads to the most famous Hermetic maxim, found in a related text called the Emerald Tablet. As above, so below. This phrase has been repeated by occultists for centuries. What does it actually mean? It means the architecture of the cosmos is perfectly mirrored in the architecture of your own consciousness. The macrocosm is the microcosm. This idea was terrifying to the institutional church. For over 1,000 years, the religious hierarchy had maintained a strict monopoly on salvation. God was an angry monarch in the sky. You were a miserable sinner on the ground. The only way to bridge the gap was through the priest. The church held the keys to the gates of heaven. But the Corpus Hermeticum bypassed the gate entirely. If your mind is essentially divine, you do not need a mediator. You do not need an institution to translate the will of heaven. You only need to clear the distortions in your own perception. So let us reconstruct what a Hermetic initiate actually did. How did they practice this? They did not stand in graveyards waving wands or sacrificing animals. They sat in quiet rooms. They closed their eyes. They engaged in a practice of intense philosophical visualization. The first book of the Corpus, known as the Poimandres, instructs the reader to internalize the cosmos. You sit in silence. You strip away the physical sensations of the body. You imagine the vastness of the earth. You expand your awareness to include the oceans, the atmosphere, the moon, and the planets. You hold the entire solar system in your mind. You stretch your imagination until it encompasses the infinite void of the stars. The text literally commands the initiate to leap clear of all that is corporeal. It tells you to rise above all time and become eternal. Then, it says, you will apprehend God. This was an act of radical psychological expansion. The initiate was practicing ego death centuries before the term existed. They were training their neurobiology to dissolve the boundary between the self and the environment. They mapped the human psyche onto the 7 visible planets of ancient astronomy. To ascend to the divine, the initiate had to mentally travel upward through these planetary spheres. At each sphere, they left behind a specific human vice. They left anger at the sphere of Mars. They left greed at the sphere of Jupiter. They left lust at the sphere of Venus. They were systematically dismantling their own reactive animal nature. When you hold the entire universe in your mind, you realize that the container is greater than the contents. Your mind is the container. This psychological technology was seen as the ultimate heresy. The church recognized the threat immediately. They did not ban these texts because they thought Hermeticism was silly superstition. They banned it because they knew it worked. It produced individuals who were fearless. It produced minds that were self-actualized and utterly immune to psychological control. The most famous example is Giordano Bruno. Bruno was a brilliant Dominican friar who read the works of Marsilio Ficino. He fully absorbed the Hermetic philosophy. Bruno realized that if God is infinite, the universe must also be infinite. There is no center. There are countless suns and countless earths. Bruno traveled across Europe teaching this Hermetic vision of an infinite, living cosmos. The Roman Inquisition hunted him down. They imprisoned him for 8 years. They tortured him. They demanded he recant his belief in an infinite universe and the divinity of the human mind. He refused. In the year 1600, they dragged him to the Campo de' Fiori in Rome. They tied him to a wooden stake. They burned him alive. They tied his tongue so he could not speak to the crowd. They were terrified of the words he might say. The church tried to erase the Hermetic tradition, but ideas cannot be burned. They merely went underground. The occult traditions of the West all became secret carriers of the Hermetic virus. The scholars of the Renaissance, like Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, took this Hermetic worldview and encoded it into his 3 books of occult philosophy. Later, the esoteric orders of the 19th century built their entire systems upon it. The writings of figures like Eliphas Levi, and later Aleister Crowley in his magnum opus Liber ABA, are saturated with the fundamental Hermetic assumption that the focused human mind can alter the fabric of reality. But here is the counterintuitive twist. Magic was never about the supernatural. It was always about the self. The church painted Hermeticists as dangerous warlocks summoning demons in the dark. In reality, they were early cognitive scientists. They were mapping the hidden capacities of the human brain. The demons they were battling were internal psychological blockages. The angels they were invoking were higher states of cognitive integration. They used complex symbols, planetary correspondences, and elaborate rituals not to manipulate the physical world, but to hack their own nervous systems. Look at modern psychology. Look at the science of neuroplasticity. We now know that the stories you tell yourself physically rewire the neural pathways in your brain. When you shift your internal locus of control, your brain chemistry changes. When you truly believe that you are the author of your reality rather than a passive victim of circumstance, cortisol drops, serotonin and dopamine increase. You become capable of profound resilience and focus. The Hermeticists understood this mechanism intuitively. By adopting the radical belief that their minds were structurally identical to the divine mind, they unlocked flow states of immense creative power. They induced profound altered states of consciousness without drugs. They relied purely on the focused application of will, breath, and imagination. The knowledge they protected is not dead. It is hiding in plain sight. Every time you consciously reframe a negative thought, you are using it. Every time you step back and observe your own thinking process, you are practicing a fragmented piece of the Hermetic art. You are engaging the divine mind to govern the animal nature. The ancients knew that the human body is a temporary vessel, but the consciousness inside it is an ancient, fundamental force of nature. The church tried to erase this truth because a population of self-aware, self-directed individuals cannot be ruled by fear. They burned the books. They burned the men who read them. But the architecture of reality cannot be legislated away. The Hermetic wisdom survives because it is written in the very structure of your nervous system. You stand in the dark. The candle is lit. You don't know what you're doing, but something in you does. Only now, you realize the dark is just your own mind. The candle is your own awareness. And that ancient spark inside you has known exactly what to do all along.